Hey everyone, Keisha here again. We're going to talk about bioremediation using compost. And we've already talked about thermophilic composting and growing microorganisms. We've talked about sifting and when to do that and how to preserve that life in the soil and those fungal networks. Got a picture of that here again to remind you. That these guys are present in the compost. If we make our compost correctly, what we're really doing is growing a whole host of microorganisms that can help do work for us. And so bioremediation is a huge part of our job. It's one of the main reasons that we create this type of compost. This compost can be created at any scale. It's easy to grow microbes at home. It's easy to grow microbes at a medium scale like we do. And then also we've seen really large scale producers be able to create a product that can be used for helping to reduce salts in the soil, clean up different pollutants and chemicals that we don't want there, especially after fires in California. That's a large part of our work. And what I want to try to explain in this short amount of time we have is that it's actually that soil ecosystem, those microbes in the soil that are doing this good work. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, the solution to pollution is dilution. My grandpa used to say this all the time, and I never really understood what it meant until I got into this work. But it is, if we're not putting extraordinarily heavy loads of chemicals onto the soil. If there is an ecosystem, a microbial ecosystem present around the root zones of those plants, then yes, we can actually, dump quite a bit of toxic waste into the soil and it can be dealt with by the microbes. But what happens is as we continually put pressure on our ecosystems in the soil, what happens is they end up dying, being crushed out, and they're not able to be there to do that good work anymore. So bacteria and fungi, pictured here, the bacteria are hard to see, but the fungi is quite obvious. It's that filamentous, ropey, dark strands that you see in the background of the photo. Those guys are responsible for doing a lot of the cleanup with the chemicals in the world. And I'll start with this is a client that we have. They're in Salinas. And this area has a lot of agriculture on it, primarily strawberries and kale, broccoli, cauliflower, things of that nature. And if you pull a soil test or a water test from the wells here or any of the soil around, you're going to find very, very, very heavy salt levels. And this is coming from the fertilizers that have been repeatedly put into the ground. It's very sandy soil there. So the water table has actually been contaminated by the salts. You can see the photo here up in the corner on the left where it says conventional farming. That is a photo of the microorganisms that we took from the soil across the street from the farm we were working with. There are not many microbes present there. You can see a few bacteria, but beyond that, it's mostly just salts. And you can see on the other side of the photo, you can see a little fungal hyphae there. You can see a lot more space and aggregation happening. And what's going on there is he's been working with microorganisms. They've been coming into that soil, and the bacteria especially is starting to actually make food of all of that nutrient, that non-organic synthetic nitrogen that they've been putting in the soil. The bacteria and fungi are actually making that more bioavailable for the plants and, essentially cleaning up the ground. And this is really possible to do. There's a lot of our farmland has too much salt in it, and it's pretty simple to actually make compost at home that has the microorganisms in it that are going to be able to start binding up these salts and making them, readily available, easy to use for the plants. Now, when we're talking about, more toxic compounds, like what happens when you have a fire, this is going to be different, a different procedure than what we would do in agriculture. So, it is actually these microorganisms are breaking these bonds in these different chemicals. They're actually using them as a food resource and pulling them into their body. Now, sometimes they are able to take those toxic compounds and make them, into plant food. They are not going to hurt anybody anymore. They're not toxic at all. But sometimes actually when those bonds are broken, the chemicals that are residual in the soil are still going to be hurtful to people. and animals and, our crops, our food crops. And so it's important to understand how we're going to use this compost. So in a situation like this, the building is burned down. There could have been, you know, all kinds of heavy metals and unknown chemicals inside that barn. There was fuel inside that barn and oil. And so we're going to treat this different. We're still going to use compost to bind up all of those toxic chemicals, and it will. But we have to think that those chemicals are still going to be inside the bodies of the microorganisms, and we don't want to put those somewhere where we're going to have food crops. So as you can see in this photo, we're actually covering the majority of that burn zone where the building was with plastic. And then all around the edges of that plastic, I have another photo, it's not from the same event, but we're going to use these wattles that are filled with compost. And so what happens is when the water comes and washes through that compost, it's carrying those heavy metals and those toxic compounds with it. It's actually going to bind up inside of these wattles. I mean, probably not all of it, but as much as we can get. And then these wattles need to be pulled out and actually thrown into the dump because they are toxic. But, we can use this kind of technology. It's low tech, it's easy, you can do it at home. You can actually buy these jute bags or plastic bags if you're going to remove and put in the dump. They're easy to find. You can make your compost at home, and you can use it to filter any kind of water that might be running over a toxic area. You could use it in a pond. I've seen people clean the water that runs, across their land into their ponds by staking in these kind of what we would call a biofilter. And interestingly enough, I've been speaking with engineers that, they went to school because they wanted to learn, how do cities take our wastewater and reclaim it? How do they take something that's so toxic and turn it into a clean material that can be reused on crops? And, what they said was, the truth was when they got all the way down to the bottom of the system, the filters were biofilters made out of compost. And so these compost piles with these humic and fulvic structures in them, in these microorganisms that can bind up these toxic materials, they can be one of our most useful tools for working with bioremediation, whether we're talking about a very passive design where we want to come in and reduce salts, reduce glyphosate, reduce, possible oil and gasoline runoff, from the roads, or if we want to come in and much more intensively remediate a zone, it is very, very possible to do with this compost. And like I said, not all compost is going to work in the same way, but I think most compost is going to have at least some kind of effect. Now, if we're going to be looking at our compost under the microscope, we know we've got diverse bacteria, we know we've got diverse fungi. We can even do DNA analysis to see what microorganisms are in our compost. Are they microorganisms that are known to be used for bioremediation? These tools are very available to us now, and we can use them to get a deeper look into what microbes we're working with and how we can use these microorganisms. Now, I know there are lots of people out there that are working with fungi and very specific species of fungi, very specific species of bacteria that are known to break down certain toxic elements. And I recommend check out Peter McCoy's work. Look at the work of Paul Stamets. They've both published a lot of books that talk about mycoremediation, which is very, very interesting and working very well. We've talked about using these different bacteria and fungi in dumps to try to remediate that ground after they've capped off, all of that toxic waste that's been going in there for years. And, it's just starting to be something that, a tool that's really being used up front in the open. We're starting to hear about it, but compost has been used for a very, very long time to remediate wastewaters and to remediate land. So get out there, start searching around and paying attention to the folks that are in this regenerative work, and pay attention to what they're doing. Because I believe in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to become much more clear how we can use these microbes very specifically to work on the soil. Again, like we can remember, this compost product that we're making is often just free waste, free material, things that might have been put into the green bin and tossed into the dump. If we know how to use the processes correctly, these materials that were once our waste can actually be the tools that we use to remediate the soil that's around us in our community, on our farms, and in our own yards. So I hope you get out there and start doing the good work. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.